Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. Hopefully with the windows open, it's a bit cooler than it was when you first walked in here. Hopefully you can hear me at the back okay? Brilliant, great. If this next bit is too loud, I apologise, but I'm not going to bugger around with the sound, so just bear with me, okay? So some examples of both good and bad planning. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a run through of what I'm going to cover in the next 25-30 minutes or so. Tell you a little bit about myself, and then why I think marketing planning is important, and then what I consider to be the good building blocks of marketing planning. And then what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a wrap-up session, and then, assuming there'll be time, there'll be Q&A. But if there's not time for Q&A during the session, just grab me as we do some networking later on. Okay, so a little bit about me. My background is quite corporate. I spent about 25 years in the brewing industry with what was Bass, became Coors, became Molson Coors. At the heart of what I did was all around analysis, insight and strategy. So facts and figures, numbers. Loved it to bits, absolutely loved it to bits. In 2012 though, I had the opportunity to leave that industry and work almost alongside it, but also to spread my wings and actually take a lot of my learning and a lot of my skill sets into other industries. And that's what I've been doing since then. So for the last 4 years, what I've been doing is I've been still associated with the brewing industry, so I work with people like Heineken, Marston's, the British Beer and Pub Association, also Drink Aware, but also what I've taken is a lot of that corporate planning skills, or a lot of those corporate planning skills, and then taken them into SMEs and actually even startups, which has been fantastic. And it's been one of the most interesting and rewarding things that I've found is things that you get used to doing a job and you get used to being in an industry, and you sometimes don't realise that actually what you know and what you've learned actually can be used across different areas. One of the big things you probably gather from the opening video is I've got a passion for planning, and that's what I'm going to cover today. The reason I've called it marketing planning, it should become obvious as we go through, but I think one of the things I'd like to start off with is that, like many words in this day and age, marketing is very much used and abused. A lot of people use marketing for a shorthand for selling, digital, doing promotions, making ads. The reality is, like with a lot of disciplines, it's a lot more than that. The other thing that I come across with a lot of businesses is that, and you'll know this yourselves, actually making a product or providing a service is actually the easy bit. I know it sounds a bit odd, but that's the easy bit to do. The really difficult bit is actually working out how much to charge, both so your customers will actually pay you, but also so you'll make a profit. Because anybody, and I say this to people, is it's not selling if they're not paying you and if you're actually not making any money out of it. So what this is all about is some of those building blocks that help you get to that point. That's not to say you shouldn't do your promotions, your digital and all the rest of it, but actually you can't do those without this. So this is a bit sort of preachy, and I know, and I apologise for that in advance, but one of the things, and I've called it marketing plan, other people call it business plans, but it's all about actually getting your ideas and thoughts down on paper. One of the difficulties that a lot of businesses have, and particularly smaller businesses, is when you have an idea, when you want to do something, if it stays between these two things here, it never goes wrong. It always makes sense. I've never failed. It's a bit like when you're managing a football team or you're doing it. Nothing ever goes wrong between here. When you start to write things down, it makes it real. You have to articulate what you're going to do in a more honest and open way. So one of the things I say is when you're doing your marketing, plan it out. Write down what you're planning to do, and more importantly, what you expect or hope the outcomes to be. The other thing is, once you've written it down as well, it's a lot easier then to share it with either other people within your business or people outside of your business if that's appropriate. Other couple of bits and pieces around what I call marketing planning are forecasts. Now, you're probably all familiar with doing financial forecasts, particularly if you've had to ask for a loan, borrow money. You've probably done your own sales forecasts. One of the things that people often don't do when they look to do, and I use marketing, is what the likely outcomes are. And one of the biggest challenges people often have is that actually they don't either anticipate or plan for what the different outcomes with. And I've seen plenty of examples, back in the corporate world. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was asked to help on a promotion. It was for a really strong strength lager. I won't name the brand, but you wouldn't be allowed to buy it these days. And they did a great promotion, but it was too successful. And what they did is they actually ran out of all the items that they were giving away as part of the promotion. It caused them absolute chaos. There was another example not that long ago, and I can't remember the company, but they'd got some American holidays. And again, way too successful, and it nearly bankrupted the company because actually everybody bought into it and they hadn't budgeted, they hadn't planned for that level of success. We'll come on to pricing in a bit more detail later on, but that's a really big thing for me, and it's actually, again, getting your marketing planning right is a really key part of actually working out what pricing that you have to set. So try and make that a bit more real. So, as with all business things, there's lots of different ways of doing it. I've not got a particular agenda. This is my feeling based on examples that I've had and my own experiences. But what I've come up with is what I consider to be the 4 building blocks of good marketing planning. So, first and foremost, it's actually understanding your value chain. And that's just a technical term. I'll explain what it means in a minute. But it's really understanding the relationship between your costs, your prices, and therefore your profit. What I also say to people is try and do as much analysis as you're able. And that'll vary from company to company. Some people will do a lot. I mean, don't get lost in it, but some people do a lot, some people do a little. But try and understand, and by that, that's looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, looking at what the competition's doing, looking at what the marketplace is doing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, try and produce what I would call realistic forecasts. We're very guilty as human beings of going one of two ways. We can either become overly optimistic, which means everything is fantastic and I'm going to sell all of this stuff or get all of these customers, or we can go into the other mode, which is actually very pessimistic and I'm not going to sell anything. So the more information that you can gather to create what I call realistic forecasts, the better. And then finally, this is quite an important one from my point of view, but again, it'll vary from industry to industry, is try and appreciate what I call your wider market context. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean global context. That market context could be quite local. But try and understand what's going on around you, because we don't operate in a vacuum. And one of the problems is that people will often get so involved in what they're doing, they don't lift their head up and start to look at what else is going on around. And I've got some examples a bit later on I'll share with you. So, let's put down. Value chain, what is it? Very simply, and you can read the definition yourself, but it's all around that sequential approach of making something, creating value within it, but actually understanding where all of that value sits. And that doesn't matter whether you're actually B2B or B2C, is somewhere along the line, regardless of what you've got, whether you're a farmer, you'll make something, you'll sell it to a wholesaler, who'll sell it to a supermarket, who'll sell it to a consumer. It's understanding where the value is. And what you often find is that people don't appreciate what that is. So again, if I use the brewing industry as an example, because it's one I'm more familiar with, is people will look at the end price of a pint of ale or a pint of lager and go, wow, that's why the brewers are so rich, or we're so rich. But actually, when you start to break that down, there are so many different people within that chain, and actually, the brewer themselves only make a small proportion of that. And that'll be the same for a lot of your own businesses. There'll actually be other people within that chain, and you'll only be making a small amount of it. Another great example of that is all the issues that we've had around with the farmers, and actually how much milk was being sold at within supermarkets versus actually what the farmers were actually getting. Now, they've managed to address some of that by getting some guarantees, but that's a great example of how that value chain needs to be understood, because otherwise you don't actually recognise who's willing to pay what and when. Nope, just down there. The other important thing about understanding your value chain is, and this comes back to when you're setting your prices, is to understand what all the constituent parts are. It's very easy not to think of everything, and what then happens is, down the line, your profitability is actually being eroded. So, for example, if when you're trying to construct your pricing, you don't factor in, and I've had examples of this, you don't factor in your own time or your own salary or costs. The money comes in, but actually you're not making the money that you thought you were making because you've actually been doing it for free. And what I always say to people, particularly when they're starting up, is even if you only pay yourself the minimum wage, put an amount in for your costs. Because if nothing else, if you're not there, you can at least then pay somebody else to do it for you, all being well. The other thing I say in terms of understanding is there's nothing free in this world. So when you go out and about and somebody says free Wi-Fi, it's not free. Somebody's paid for it. And what you've got to then understand is who's paid for it and how do you recoup that? How do you add value to that whole process? Because otherwise what happens is you're giving everything away, but it comes back to bite you at the end when you do your accounts. Right. Oops, it's one too many. Analysis. To be honest with you, this is all really quite simple. It's just about trying to understand what's happened in the past, where it's happened, and why it's happened. And it's no more complicated than that. But unless you understand that, unless you understand what the levers are within your particular business, the danger is that you can end up making decisions that make things worse. And again, great examples that where people have not understood why something has happened, and then actually they've done additional things that have made things worse rather than actually correcting it. And that doesn't matter whether you're in manufacturing, producing products, or in services. It's actually understanding what's restricting the profitability of your business, or what's actually dragging it back down. And unless you actually understand that, I mean, you know the whole thing, you don't assume anything. If you assume anything, it makes an ass out of you and me. Do forecasts. Put that down there. Lots of different ways of doing forecasts. Again, I've just covered 3 basic sorts. So there's value-based, which is what do you have to sell just to actually cover your costs. Resource-based, what could you sell with the resources you've got available. Or actually market-based, which is what would you like to sell, so what would the market actually take. And each one of those has different different processes, different mechanics, but they've all got their own parts to play. What I do say to people as part of this, when you are doing forecasts, don't confuse forecasting with what I've called calculated values. So if you actually know that you're actually, if you actually know that you're actually going to sell something, it's not a forecast, it's a calculated value. And that's particularly when you're dealing with certain people within sales. They'll tell you that they've got a forecast, but actually it's known values, they're not forecasts. And then what I say to people then is, when you are doing forecasts, and don't be afraid of doing them, is try and be aware of the things that will affect you. Really interesting. A lot of businesses are quite seasonal, but people will often do forecasts or business projections and not take that into account. They won't take into account factors that might affect them, and that's really important to do. Similarly, actually, if you've not got a lot of data, then there's only a limit to the way you can actually forecast stuff, but don't ignore it. So, market context. You might be familiar with some of these terms. I've just spelt them out a little bit, but this is all about recognising that we don't operate in a vacuum. It's just trying to recognise within whichever marketplace, whichever industry that you're working in, what are the things that might affect you. I was talking to somebody earlier this afternoon. The introduction of a minimum wage has had a massive impact on different industries. If you don't take those things into account when you're doing your planning, when you're doing your marketing planning, then actually you can really catch a cold with them. And so, there are things within the political environment, there are economic things, there are social changes. We're looking more and more now. My guess is, and you'd have to put your hands up, that everybody in this room has got at least one of these. Actually, not knowing that this exists and not anticipating how that's going to affect your business can actually catch people out. So these are just some examples of how you can construct that. You don't have to get too carried away with it. But it's always useful to have a look at what's gone on in the past to get a sense of what might happen in the future. I usually say to people, try and reference more than one data source if you can. So don't just take one piece of information, try and cross-reference it, because it's always more useful that way. But it's all about understanding that landscape, whether it's a competitive landscape, whether it's your customers, your consumers, whatever. The more you can build up a picture about what that's all about, the better place you're going to be in. Okay. So, rather than me just talking in the abstract all the time, which I know it doesn't always work for everybody, what I've done this afternoon is I've brought together a whole load of examples which hopefully will bring this to light. So this is real data, this is not made up numbers, okay? And I'll try and talk through examples of each. So one of the big things when you're looking at pricing, for example, particularly when you want to take a price increase, is how much should you increase? Now there are lots of reasons and why you might do and lots of things to take into account. One of the things I suggest to people, if you do nothing else, have a look at what the underlying rate of inflation is. The other thing is, this is really important also, not only when you're thinking about your own prices, but when you're actually negotiating your costs with your suppliers. Again, live example. It's really interesting that the government talk about CPI as their headline measure, and the Bank of England headline measure of inflation. But if you're like me, all our phone contracts are all actually driven by what goes on with RPI, and actually understanding those fine nuances, it's usually at least 1% difference. So the level of inflation that actually people are talking about when you're negotiating your contracts, people will be saying, oh, well, we'll just go by inflation. Just be really clear which one it is. And what you'll also find is beyond that, and I won't bore you with all the details, but actually beyond that is the government track lots of different industries. And I have to say I got caught out once when, some years ago, negotiating with a number of other people, and we agreed for an inflationary increase, which at the time felt the right thing to do. What we missed was the subtleties that actually the person that we were negotiating with was talking about the service industry level of inflation, which the government actually track, which is about 2% higher than everything else. And so we'd ended up getting locked in for 3 years on an inflation level that we hadn't realised we'd done. So little things like that are important. Unemployment, again, understanding where things are within the country. These are national figures, but for example, if you take the West Midlands, the headline rate is actually above that. It's about 6.1. Men is 6.4, and I think women 5.8. Nothing you can do about it, but actually just understanding what that local economy is doing can give you a sense and a feel of how people might be feeling. It's quite interesting. If you look at the West Midlands, the East Midlands, the figures are a bit lower. They're more around 4.7, 4.8. So just that little bit in terms of if you're looking to operate your business, just by moving 10 miles up the road, there might be a slightly different economic climate to be aware of. Paying bonuses, again, not going to quote the figures, but again, when you're negotiating with staff, when you're talking to people, actually understanding what that headline rate is, actually you can use as both a stick and a carrot. Won't bother about GDP, probably not important for you guys necessarily. Retail sales, I'll skip on this one because I'll cover the internet, but this one. All right, this is one I quite like. I personally use this quite a lot, and what this actually does is, although it does two things for me. It tells you which supermarkets are more likely to be going discounting in the near future, because in terms of how they're actually performing. But it also is a nice barometer in terms of actually the way people are thinking. So if you can see from this, and this is late, I mean literally, I think I updated that earlier this week, is you can see how the economy is continually gravitating towards what we used to call the discounters, Aldi and Lidl, and that starts to help a mindset. And so actually what we've done is we've actually become conditioned to looking for those lower prices. And actually, whether we like it or not, we very rarely can distinguish between our work life and our sort of personal life. And so what we're actually doing as a nation is we're actually encouraging people to look at lowest prices. And actually, that's really important for us as business people to recognise that we have to push back against that, to say, actually, we don't want to offer you, and there's nothing wrong with Aldi and Lidl, but they've got a different business model. Their business model is on a low-cost basis. Actually, and if your business model is on a low-cost basis, then you can afford to offer those sort of pricing. However, if you've got more value to add, if you've got more things to offer, then you need to be building that value into your pricing structures and your pricing architectures, so that you can position yourself more towards a Waitrose view rather than an Aldi view. Again, this is something that Asda do. It's just a nice little barometer in terms of what people's discretionary income is. And again, it's more of a direction of travel rather than the absolute. Just shows you in terms of how much things have improved, relatively speaking, for people. Doesn't mean that actually they're spending more money on what you want to sell them, but it can help sense where people's mind space is. Again, depending on whether you're business to business or business to consumer, again, there's facts and stats out there that show you what average debt is, what sort of debt people are carried away. What I do sometimes, and I won't do it today, you'll be pleased to know, is, in fact, I'll usually do it on the next chart. that was personal debt, this is household debt, is what you usually find in the room. There's two groups of people, and I'm not going to make eye contact with anybody. There's the smug ones who are going, well, I haven't got that much debt. And there's another group of you who are going, oh my God, is that what the average is? Because mine's a lot more than that. But again, understanding where people are on that whole spectrum is really, really important. And then finally, and again, this is freely available, consumer confidence. And again, it's just a nice, it's not something you have to look at all the time, but it's a nice barometer insofar as what the nation is thinking, how people are feeling, because you can't know what's going on in everybody's heads, but what these sort of statistics at a macro level can give you is a sort of a general feeling about how the country's feeling about things. I know I've rushed through all those, but I said those are real examples of some of the big data sets that you can look at when you're thinking about your planning. So as I said, some of them might be relevant, some might not, some might be just interesting. So, with all that in mind, what I'd like to do in terms of this little bit is finish up on another video clip about a couple of people who perhaps didn't plan as well as they could have done. Okay?
Next came Ken and Brian from Brian Farlett with their highly original animal device. What would the James
I'm Ken and this is my co-director Brian, and we're looking for an investment of £400,000 for a 2% stake in our invention, the Kitten Stomper.
Thanks, Ken. This is a working model of the Kitten Stomper. As you can see, it has a flap here, so that you can insert and secure the kitten like so. The lid is a floating mechanism. It's secured on a series of springs, so when you place the device on the ground with the kitten inside it and stomp it like so, remains completely rigid. And you can continue stomping and after you finish stomping your kitten, it always reverts to its original shape.
Any questions? It's a meowvelous piece of engineering. But when you say stomp the kitten, I'm assuming this will kill it. Yes, the full weight of any adult from, say, 8 to 14 stone coming down upon the kitten is, we think, more than 98% likely to result in the kitten's demise.
I think the point that Peter Pips is trying to make, is why you don't like the kitten cats?
We do like kittens.
Oh yeah, they're very sweet. So why do you want to stomp them to death, the life out of them?
We don't personally want to stomp them to death.
We're not the market. Doesn't everybody like kittens?
Yes, of course I do.
So where's your market then?
I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure where you're coming from here.
Everyone likes kittens. So who would want to stomp them to death in your kitten stomper?
Ken and Brian have realised nobody wants to stomp kittens. There's no market for their kitten stomper whatsoever. Saudi Arabia? I've got got 100,000 fitness centres in Saudi Arabia and not one kitten stomper, I'm out. I like the little kitty cats. Nobody wants to hurt the kitty peeps, so I'm out.
I don't like kittens, but I don't like you. And for that reason alone, I'm out.
It's all down to the grumpy woman.
I like kittens. But I also think there may be a market for stomping them. So I am interested. But your figures of £400,000 for 2% of the business are way off the mark. I will give you your £400,000. But for that, I want 3% of the business.
Would it be okay if we consulted for a minute?
Thanks very much, but we're going to pass that. I think we can do it.
So, I hope you enjoyed that. It was about the only one that I could vaguely find that got planning into it. So, so just to wrap up, to me, planning is really important. I've called it marketing planning. You can call it business planning, but it's all around planning. It's about understanding those fundamentals. Because without understanding those fundamentals, hopefully you won't have such a severe experience as the two guys beforehand. But it's all about understanding that value chain to get your pricing right. It's understanding your marketplace by doing proper SWOT analyses. It's about creating proper and realistic forecasts so that you can manage your resources properly. And it's understanding that broader market or consumer context. Okay, so all needs to finish off with that is obviously flown through it at lightning speed in terms of today, but what I actually do is I run a couple of different courses at the moment in Burton-on-Trent, although I'm looking at doing some more locally, which actually takes some of those theories and actually looks at them in far more detail, obviously, and we're going to the nitty-gritty of different bits and pieces. So those are available if anyone wants to come and talk to me afterwards. Just leaves me to say thanks very much for your time and your patience. And I guess any questions, as long as it's not about kitten stompers. That's either a good sign or an awful sign. No?
Well, thank you, Chris. That was fantastic.